Quick little shout out to my mom. Thank you so much for watching. UG, even though you have no idea what I'm talking about, she really has no idea. But the support is always appreciated, so I love you, mom. And everyone else, make sure you go say hi to your parents or your guardians or whoever you love. Hi everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about some balance ideas that I have that I would like to see before End of Dragons launches. I had a video a while back covering the combat evolution of Guild Wars 2 over the years, and that was intended to be a precursor, a sister video to this video that I'm doing now, but it's taken me so long to get to this one because of all the betas and all the news. So now that we're having a slight little break, I thought this was the perfect time to go over my long list of changes. With this video, they are changes that are directed more so towards PvP. Some of these could be implemented in PvE as well, but this is a bit more of a competitive, structured PvP video. And I was going over them multiple times yesterday and last night, and I think I finally hit something that I would like to see. I feel pretty confident about these changes, more or less, but once again, this is from that perspective of how I would like to see maybe some balance in the direction of gameplay and PvP. So let's begin. In addition to the disclaimers about this video being PvP focused, and also this coming from my own experience in PvP, this video also targets two of the main classes that I play, but I also happen to believe are a little bit overpowered right now and are probably more deserving of more massive overhauls or reworks in general. So I'm focusing on Necromancer and Guardian. I do touch on the other professions as well, but for the most part, it's with Necro and Guardian. And final disclaimer, when I talk about the elite specializations, I have added new little trade-offs to each of the very first trait that you have when you select your elite specialization, but you'll see some examples of that when we get to them. So first and foremost, let's talk about Necromancer. Now, Necromancer is extremely powerful right now in PvP. It is a powerhouse in terms of damage and also survivability. So I wanted to tackle some of the radii and also the recharge of certain skills and even sometimes the power coefficients. But once again, I'm not a balance developer, I'm not a systems developer, so these are just purely spitballs. The numbers can of course adapt and change. But first, a little bit of a buff. Putrid Curse. Currently the Scepter feels like it sometimes lacks extra life force generation, so I think Putrid Curse, its auto attack finale, should grant either 1.5% or 2% life force, just a little something. And then Staff Marks, you might have realized this from my previous combat video. I think these should be brought down to about 180 radius, perhaps 210, but I think right now where they're at, they're a little too large, so bringing them down in size I think would maybe feel a little bit better. Next, Lich Form. So in my perfect world, I would replace Lich Form with Grim Spectre. I think Lich Form as an idea is really cool for an elite specialization, but having an extra transform which gives you so much health and also currently so much damage might be a little too aggressive. So Grim Spectre would be changed slightly. It siphons health and life force from nearby enemies, gaining vitality when you hit an enemy with this skill. It would be on an 80-second cooldown with a radius of 600, and it would affect 3 targets in a structured PvP setting. Perhaps in a PvE environment and world versus world, maybe 5. But a little bit more extra defense for that elite skill. I think having an elite skill that is focused on defense isn't necessarily bad on Necromancer, but you should be a little wary because they are already very tanky. Or another thing would just to bring the Lich's power down and precision by quite a bit, while giving them about 5 seconds extra in the duration of the elite skill. Next is a death magic change on Poison Nova, the Grandmaster for the minions. It currently explodes, leaving a radius of around like 240. I think this should also be brought down to 180 because they are minions. You can't really place them, so I I can understand why they went maybe a bit larger over time. However, you can have so many minions up at once that the whole field becomes a poison field and a poison nova, and it can be very strong and debilitating. And I'm not sure if they destroy projectiles, but if they do, that should not be it. It's extremely strong. So now we're gonna go into Scourge. I guess I have Scourge first. I guess I should have swapped them, but we'll go in the order of things. So first, Scourge. This is where the trade-off comes into play. So currently the very first trait, the very first trait, I think in the flip, it would be over here. It's Mantle of Sand, which gives you sand shades, which gives you punishment skills. I think this is the perfect trait to add the drawback as they did with Ranger. And I would love to see this be added to other elite specializations. So for Mantle of Sand, I just theory crafted, specializing in barriers, Scourges have reduced toughness by about 150. But for Mantle of Sand, I think this would be perfectly fine because it is so tanky through its barrier. Reducing a little bit of that toughness would be nice compensation to just focus in on that barrier. Next are more core and fundamental changes to Scourge I would not mind seeing. Sand Shades. Currently we can pop 3 and you yourself act as a 4th. I think in PvP, you never really need 4 active at once other than massive area pressure. So I would not mind seeing the number of Sand Shades be brought down to 2 active while maintaining 3 charges, so you can have 2 up with having an extra charge just in case you need to relocate one of them very quickly. It allows for a little bit of counterplay, a little bit more of correction as well. So I think this would be a perfect situation for Scourge to be brought down in its area oppressiveness. And you yourself act as that 3rd anyway, so you'd be affecting 9 targets when in structured PvP there are typically only 5, but then you have to think about maybe some pets or minions. Next is a change to Sand Savant I would not mind seeing. I've kind of touted this a while back, but I really dislike the trait Sand Savant right now because it just guarantees intense point pressure. And while they do increase the cooldown drastically, I have never really felt a desire to play with Sand Savant because already you can just pop 3 Sand Shades and get decent map pressure anyways. So with Sand Savant, it doesn't really feel applicable to PvP. The only area I could maybe see that being is perhaps world versus world, but still the increase in duration feels really gutting. However, changing it to maybe be more in line with the whole top trait about barriers could be interesting, but there's catches as well. So for the new trait, I would not mind seeing barriers applied to yourself are 25% less strong. However, applying barriers to others is 20% more effective. Additionally, Sand Shades have reduced recharge of 25%. So this allows you to really pop up your Sand Shades more frequently, so you can really play with that Sand Shade mode. You might not necessarily be getting more burning damage, or you might not necessarily be able to sustain yourself through multiple boons, and your barrier is being reduced. However, you will be able to be that more support, that pure support role, where you're giving up some of your own defenses to bolster your allies, making yourself a very specialized support in barrier application. Ghastly Breach. I would not mind seeing this be changed a little bit, because right now it feels really competitive with Plague Lands, but Plague Lands does so much more condition damage. I would say bring this down to 240 radius. 300 is maybe a bit large. And it no longer applies slow. However, you can cast this and place it at range. It's now something you can cast from a distance, so you don't have to put yourself in pure danger. This ability would now change to be a bit more of a boon corruption and also torment application, while also applying some might to your allies. I wouldn't mind this. It shrinks it a little bit while also gaining that lovely addition of being able to shoot it at range. Next, Garish Pillar. I would not mind seeing this have a little quarter of a second cast time, because having an instant fear application while doing other things can be very strong. With area pressure, it can be really difficult to sometimes dodge those fears, but having a little cast time slows the Scourge down just ever so, and it might not be as impactful as other nerfs that could be on this kit. However, it's something. Now we're going into Reaper. Shroud Knight, this is the other drawback. Specializing in raw power, condition damage is less effective, 10% less effective. I think this would make sense, and you might be wondering, what about Deathly Chill? We'll get there in a minute. So that's something I would not mind seeing. Next, we have Executioner Scythe. In PvP, a bunch of the stun skills have been reduced in power, so I gave this a little extra something. You reduce the radius to 210 with the Ice Field, but it now finishes a downed enemy if targeted by the strike. It's in the name, Executioner Strike. If you successfully kill an enemy, a downed enemy, it will add 8 seconds to the cooldown upon a successful execution. I think that would be really awesome to see on Reaper. Yes, it's probably very strong, but adding a little extra cooldown, 8, maybe even 10 seconds increase, if you want that secured kill, perhaps. Honestly, saying that now, it might actually be very strong. But next we have Rise. I think Rise could use a quarter second of a cast time. It really is an instant activation, and you get a lot of toughness and a lot of damage redirection back to your minions. So having Rise be on a little bit of a cast time, some interrupt potential, but really it just is for that slightly slower playstyle that the Reaper should be very comfortable playing in. Next, we have Deathly Chill. Now, these are some trade ideas that I actually really enjoy. So Deathly Chill is currently a Grandmaster. What I would do is move it to the Adept tier. Chill deals strike damage over time. This trait used to have Chill be a damaging condition that scaled off a Connie power. However, because Reaper is so focused on strike and physical damage, the condition application isn't really suited anymore, especially with, of course, Scourge, and if Harbinger isn't changed, there's no real point for a bleeding application. So Chill dealing strike damage with 200 each second, and it scales off of power, that could be really interesting. 200 could be a little strong baseline. This could, of course, numbers can change to 150, etc., etc. But I think this being an Adept tier also plays better with, you know, do I want shorter shouts? Do I want more consistent damage over time? Or do I want to be able to move really nicely? And then this would place Chilling Nova into the Grandmaster tier. Currently in PvP, it does little to no damage, and while it is nice for chill application, I think this perhaps fits a little bit more in a Grandmaster setting where you just cause a Nova of chill. So I would up the damage to 250 now that it is in a Grandmaster slot, up the chill duration by 1 second, but reduce the number of targets down to 3 while keeping the 10-second cooldown. This would allow you to, you know, still excel in a multi-target fight, but 5 targets seems a little excessive. And then finally, Reaper's Onslaught. This might be the biggest nerf, and perhaps controversial yet brave of me to say. I think that this should not grant ferocity. I think quickness and the reduced cooldown on your successful auto attacks are strong enough as a Grandmaster. Quickness in PvP is extremely strong, and with Reaper being so slow and already having really strong power coefficients and power damage, the ferocity seems to be a little bit of an excessive addition. Additionally, there's already a Grandmaster trait in Reaping that gives you 300 ferocity. So currently, you can be getting 600 flat ferocity just by being in Shroud, and it becomes almost a little too difficult to fight against. And while it feels very almost satisfying to play with because you are so strong, I don't know if the ferocity is needed, so I would honestly get rid of it or drastically bring down the ferocity to like 100. Now we're going to talk about Guardian. Now Guardian is my main of all mains, so being able to look at Guardian critically and say that the thing that I love the most is perhaps a little too crazy right now, I think is a healthy mindset to have. Once again, my own personal experience. So first and foremost, Signet of Mercy. This is the Res Signet. I think all Res Signets should be placed at 100 cooldown, except the Necromancer's one, because the Necromancer, you sacrifice half of your life. So I think allowing Necromancer that a little bit extra niche of being a strong Resurrector fits. But with Guardian and Elementalist and any other Res Signets or Res skills, I think a flat 100 would be perfectly fine because they can be very strong in PvP settings. Next, Symbol of Punishment, the Scepter symbol. I think the cooldown should be 10 seconds. I mean, it's 10 seconds in PvE and World versus World. And, you know, PvP, it's a very strong skill. It's a might stacker, even though you can't get full might, but it's consistent multi-packet damage. You trigger your burning quite frequently because it does 2 features of damage, the striking fists and also the symbol itself. So I think 10 seconds wouldn't be too bad. Next, Force of Will, a Grandmaster for Honor. I think the Vitality should be brought down to 200. just so you don't get super tanky. And then it would maybe incentivize you to maybe take Writ of Persistence or Pure of Voice, even though Pure of Voice is taken pretty well and pretty often. Next, Inspired Virtue. They added this to where it increases damage for each boon you have. I think this is too strong on a minor trait. Maybe this would be in a trait that you have to pick, but I would get rid of the increased damage per boon. Next, Renewed Focus is the staple in PvP. And it's kind of hard to balance this skill because it only does one thing for a set duration. But the only idea that I can come up with is to perhaps increase the cooldown to around 120 to make it a little bit more of a commitment to take. Maybe this would allow you to maybe take Feel My Wrath or any other elite skills on elite specializations. Permeating Wrath, its radius should be down to 180. And the next, Battle Presence. This is a more interesting change that forces Guardians to be in that more pure support playstyle without necessarily being able to tank themselves. You might have seen this on the Scourge idea change, but currently, if you're playing support, you're also able to tank incredibly well, and I think that should be brought down a bit. So Battle Presence. Nearby allies gain the passive effect of Virtue Skill 2. However, the passive healing from Virtue Skill 2 on yourself is weaker by 30%. So you're getting 30% less healing, which means if you were doing 100 healing to allies, you would only be getting 70 yourself. And then finally, Monk's Focus. I think the theory should only apply to yourself. This Monk's Focus trait is always taken as the Grandmaster, and I think it is strong and still strong inherently, but the addition of Ally Fury is perhaps a little excessive, but in PvP, I think this would be fine if it just applied it to yourself. People would still take it. Now we're going into the elite specs for Guardian. We have Dragon Hunter. This is the drawback, the virtuous action. Specializing in strike damage, Dragon Hunters have reduced condition damage. So with burning being so prevalent, burning in and of itself is one of the strongest damaging conditions in the game. So when you are specializing into the Dragon Hunter, you lose a little bit of that condition pressure, and you'll have to really build in condition damage to start to see more burning if you do want to play a burning Dragon Hunter. And then next, we're going into the longbow, Deflecting Shot. I was inspired by the Blade Sworn's pistol, Dragon's Roar, because it also pushes you back slightly when you use this ability. And I think Deflecting Shot because it does have a large windup. And it is supposed to be that slight gap creator because it knocks back. You don't have any evasion on the longbow, but I think if it pushed you back slightly by 120, similar to Dragon's Roar, that would just maybe give you a little bit of extra distance in certain situations. And then next, Hunter's Ward, I would just increase the cooldown to 45 seconds because Hunter's Ward can be very strong. And then next, we have some traps. Dragon's Maw, I think 3/4 of a cast time is perfectly fine. And I would up the cooldown to 65 seconds, just a bit. Test of Faith is one of the traps that does not have a cast time, which is very strange because it's not a stun break. I think the stun break trap, it's fine that it doesn't have a cast time. Test of Faith, I think this does deserve a cast time. So half a second cast time like the other traits would be perfectly fine, and I would up the cooldown to 35 seconds. Hunter's Fortification. I've also floated this idea before, and I would love to see this to differentiate Dragon Hunter traps a little bit. Traps can now be set at range of 800 with a half a second activation time on top of the cast time. So you are a little bit more slow and methodical, but it's that fortifying a position and really planning out that I would like to see more of. And you would able to be dodge out of this to have some counterplay if you are paying attention. And then of course you keep the secondary effect of removing a condition when you block. I think that's perfectly fine. It's not the strongest thing in the world, but it does allow you to shake off some conditions. Next, in-game Hunter. I think the damage increase should be brought down to 12% in PvP because it's so much more consistent than the Heavy Light trait, which gives you 15% increased damage to disabled foes and foes that are controlled. So I think this would allow it to be brought down just a little bit. Maybe it would allow people to take Heavy Light rather than just feeling that they have to default to Big Game Hunter. I mean, Big Game Hunter is still really strong with that vulnerability and the duration increase. Now Firebrand. Purity of Word. Very first trait. It's the drawback, a little bit of the trade-off. Specializing in studies of lore, Firebrands have reduced toughness. Lore-wise, I feel like you've become a bit of a book nerd, so you're not really going out and lifting the weights. So your toughness is a little bit lowered. It's by 150. So you might be a little bit more squishy. So if you are playing that burst firebrand condition playstyle, you have to be careful. This also affects support builds. Support builds are very, very tough in and of themselves from mostly their application of boons. I'm aware of that. But getting attacked, you'll now be taking a little bit more damage, and you have to play a little bit smarter. So I didn't mention this, however, I'm just not thinking of it. The mantra heal in PvP has been nerfed so much that the healing is so minimal, and I understand it has very consistent Aegis application, but I think the healing aspect could be brought up just a little bit. Next, we have all Tome Chapter 4 skills. I think the radius should be reduced down to 300. Right now it's like 360 or something. And then for a trait, Unrelenting Criticism. I think a lot of the traits in Firebrand are pretty fine. Some of them are a little bit boring because it's a lot of like just reapplying quickness, which isn't my favorite. But Unrelenting Criticism, I think as a adept trait is very strong because it allows your symbol to daze, which is an interrupt. It's a CC skill and it's on a very low cooldown. But there is an interesting bleed factor. So I want to keep the bleed factor where you have a chance of bleeding your target. But instead of the days, I think this should just allow your bleeding to have increased duration by 33%. You have already some bleeds on the Firebrand, but they don't last very long. So if you take this, it bolsters some of that bleeding uptime to allow for a little bit more consistent ticking damage, while allowing your fire and your burning to be that hard-hitting burst condition. Those are the big two, Necromancer and Guardian, from my perspective. Some of the changes are focused around increasing some cooldowns, maybe adding a little bit of cast times here and there, reducing the survivability of those classes if they are playing support roles, aka Sans Savant, Battle Presence, Purity of Word, reducing the toughness. Now we're going to be going into the other professions. The other professions are not as extensive. They are more so just little buffs and adjustments here and there. So first and foremost, Mesmer. We have Portal Entree. Portal duration is currently 30 seconds. Just up it to 40. I mean, people were very sad because it used to be 60 and it was brought down by half. That might have been a little severe. That might have been a little harsh. So I think by adding 10 seconds back to it, maybe people would play with Portal a little bit more. It might not necessarily be a you have to take it all the time skill as the 60 seconds were, but it would at least feel a little bit better to take it. And then Portal Exaunt, or the exit, when you exit and finally use the portal. It'd be really interesting if this skill, when you use the portal, removes Cripple and Immobilize upon using the portal for everyone who takes it. It allows it to be a little bit more supportive. And additionally, if you are immobilized, that would mean you have to be like immobed on the portal. And by taking it, it would just get rid of that. Cripple, you already walk so much slower, so if you are away from the portal, you really have to be lucky enough to get to it, or use another movement skill like Blink to get to that, to remove it, and to allow yourself to escape a little bit. So I don't think that would be super powerful, it's just a little bit of a quality of life. Next is another glamour change with Null Field. Currently there are no stun breaks on glamours, and Null Field I don't think is taken all that often, so just give it a stun break. Maybe people might take it because it's pretty low cooldown, and the boon destruction and the condition removal is pretty nice, but maybe this would incentivize people to maybe take it and play with it a little bit more. Next, into Chronomancer, we have Time Splitter, very first trait. Specializing in Chronomancy, condition damage is reduced. This is a very, I imagine the Chronomancer to be a very power bruiser oriented specialization. So this would just nerf down some of that condition application that you have as such, like Confusion. Confusion can be very damaging and sometimes people don't realize it. So just because there can be a lot of confusion throughout the Mesmer's kit, you know, you really are focusing in on that power and also extra defense and boon up times. So there might not necessarily be many conditioned Chronomancer builds out there, but as a whole, it would bring it down by 10%. Next, Gravity Well. I think the final damage of this skill should be a little bit higher. Currently, it's only 9 damage, and I understand it's CC, but it is an elite, and I think by giving it like 200 to 250 damage, it wouldn't be like out of this world super strong. I mean, currently in PvE, it's like 600, 700 damage. So this would be still fairly weak, but it'd be something. And additionally, I would increase the cooldown a little bit more to around 80 seconds, just because Gravity Well can be strong even currently. And then next is Lost Time. I would actually bring the cooldown down to 2.5 seconds. And for people who play Necromancer, you would realize that alacrity that is generated by this is in fact 3 seconds. So this would allow you to really give yourself almost permanent alacrity, which I think in certain situations is very slim. I don't think you'd be getting excessive alacrity in most PvP situations. However, I think this would be more fitting of a Grandmaster, because currently the other 2 Grandmasters are just so much stronger that I've never really felt a desire to play with Lost Time. But if you could just keep beating the cooldown, I know the cooldown right now is 3 seconds and the duration is 3 seconds, so technically you could keep something inconsistent, but this would allow it to kind of stack up ever so quicker. For Mirage, I actually don't have any trade-offs, because Mirage Cloak in PvP already gives you 1 dodge, which I think is enough of a trade-off. So Sand Shards, also known as Dune Cloak, this would now apply 2 bleeds for 3 seconds. This is the trait, Grandmaster trait, that gives you Boon Rip application on your dodge. I don't think it's strong enough, because I think Mirage is so condition focused. Giving it 2 bleeds for a little bit would just maybe incentivize people to start taking it, just for a little bit of extra bleed damage. Bleed can't always be super strong, but this would maybe be something. Who knows? Next, Crystal Sands. I would increase the range to 1200 because a lot of people use staff on Mirage, but I would increase the cast time to half a second to slow down combat in certain areas, of course, but also because you are increasing the range. This would allow people to maybe interrupt you, and if they are from range, get like an interrupting shot off if they play like high skill, perhaps. Next, Revenant. Energy Expulsion is your Ventari elite skill. I think this wouldn't be too bad of a stun break, because I can't imagine you would say, but KROOF, you get Energy Expulsion back pretty quickly because it's just destroying all your energy. So even if you have 2 energy, you can just use it. But I think by using Energy Expulsion so consistently, you're not getting any use out of it. I guess you would maybe have to think about the knockback, perhaps, or something along those lines. But I wouldn't mind seeing Energy Expulsion be a stun break, or perhaps you would say the stun break should be on the cleansing Ventari skill that cleanses conditions. But I think they could do a couple things with Energy Expulsion to allow it to be the stun break. Just an idea. And the next is actually a entire look at the energy system. Not for core Revenant or an elite spec, but for the entire profession as a whole. Back in the beta, energy that was past 50%, when you are out of combat and we're at like 75%, it would consistently degen. But they changed it a while back to where when you are out of combat, even if you're at 80-90% energy, you would instantly shoot back down to 50. However, when you use all your energy below 50%, it's also mirrored, so my hand gestures probably don't make any sense, but if you were below 50% and you get out of combat, your energy doesn't shoot back up. So it can be very weird when you save up that energy because you're not using a lot of your hard-hitting abilities that cost energy. That means that you're playing in a playstyle that allows you to be not as perhaps aggressive, but to maintain your energy a little bit more so. And I think if it just, instead of instantly shot down to 50, if it steadily started decreasing, it would maybe allow a window of you getting into another fight and starting the fight off with just a little bit extra energy. And I think the beta version of the energy was probably much more satisfying to play with because energy is so important on Revenant. So I would actually love to see them go back to the early beta version of the energy degeneration past 50%. So now we're going into the elite specs. Herald, Crystal Harbinger. Specializing in bolstered defenses, precision is reduced by 150. This would force people to play a little bit more into the precision stat. It wouldn't totally destroy precision builds per se, where you need a crit, because ultimately you can definitely get over 100% precision uptime. And in PvP, just because you are specializing into Herald, it is kind of defensive. You do have a lot of quickness and dodging and also some defensive maneuvers. Reducing some of that precision could be maybe helpful and healthy, perhaps. What do you guys think? Now we're going into Renegade. Ambush Commander. Specializing in group tactics, Renegades have reduced toughness. Renegades can be very strong with their boon uptime, their CC skills, and any other legend they're taking. So because you are very powerful in terms of power and supporting your group through boons and also alacrity, reducing that toughness might make you just slightly more squishy to kind of counteract some tank healer strong builds. So, just an idea. Short bow 4. This should be able to be used when you're looking behind your character, as most AoEs are. I still don't know why it hasn't been so, because when you're playing in action combat, short bow 4 is the worst skill to use. Looking at the legendary renegade utility skills, Kala's summons. These I would like to see no longer be NPCs, but just normal spell effects with actions. Bastion, Rage, and Soul Cleave I think are perfectly fine. I don't think they need much of a change. They already have decent cooldowns, energy costs, and energy upkeeps. But Dark Razor's Daring, I think the radius is too big. I would reduce this down to 240, and I would increase the cooldown to 16 seconds, just because having such a consistent, non-stunnable CC skill would be very jarring. And I don't think this does much damage, but if it does, of course, cull the damage a bit. And next, Ice Razor's Ire now blasts ice shards in an arc or a cone in front of them over a duration of 5 seconds with 15 hits. And I don't think this needs to cripple enemies anymore. I think the vulnerability is perfectly fine. These being projectiles, they can be reflected back to the Revenant, the Renegade. And I think the idea of having killable spirits is interesting, but in PvP, it can be really difficult because not only are they killable, they are CCable. And they don't dodge, they don't move, so, it's not like they're spawning with stability or anything. Elementalist. Stop, drop, and roll. The cooldown, I think, should be brought down to 6 seconds because it only removes chill and burning. So you would specialize in chill and burning removal. I mean, the other 2 traits are inherently so much better. It is really nice to get a free Frost Aura and regen, and it's also lovely to do more damage against vulnerable foes. I've never taken Stop, Drop, and Roll. Glyph of Renewal, once again with a res trait, or a res skill, should be brought up to a 100-second cooldown. Now into Tempest. Singularity, and the first trait with the trade-off, specializing in soothing sounds and powerful storms, Tempests have reduced toughness. Now, you might realize that on other professions, I have reduced their toughness by around 150. However, with the Elementalist already being extremely squishy and having low vitality and a low armor stat, I wanted to be a little bit more cautious with them. So I do think it's okay to reduce their toughness because they can be tanky through boons and healing and evasion. And if they're playing super glass cannon-y, I think glass cannon builds with really strong attacks should have drawbacks of you yourself get hit harder. But I think 100 is okay. 150, maybe you're pushing it. Definitely not 200, definitely not 200. But 100, sure. And then next, Tidal Surge, I would just increase the cast time to half a second to add a little bit more reaction time. And then next, or with Tidal Surge, slightly increase the animation of the crashing wave. Back in the day, it used to be very slow. It doesn't necessarily need to be as slow as it once was, but right now it's so fast. And the next, Weaver. Interestingly enough, the very first trait with Weaver is just Weaver. When no other elite specialization has that, it is a different, unique name. So I think I would actually love a rename of this. The trait Weaver, also for the sake of clarity, even though people don't necessarily talk about the very first trait in elite specs because they don't do anything, but maybe now they will if this happens. I would rename Weaver to Alonian Concentration. So concentrating and weaving elements, Weavers have reduced boon duration on themselves. When they apply boons to themselves, the boons they apply are weaker. Bolstered elements. Because of this boon duration, I don't know if this necessarily needs to be enacted, but reducing a little bit of that bruisery, bring it down to 580. I think it's like 600 right now. Just slight shaves here and there could be interesting. Because Weavers, if you play a bruiser tank bunker Weaver, it can be really hard to kill you. It can be really difficult. So now for Warrior. I would say Warrior's overall, pretty okay. I would say Berserker's power, the only thing I would maybe change is reduce the power increased duration down to 12 seconds. Just to, you know, have a little bit of a smaller window of increased power. Similarly, with all of these trade-offs, I've been putting them on the very first trait. Now, I was also heavily inspired by Fatal Frenzy. Currently, the Berserker's trade-off is on the minor trait, but not on the first one. It's on the Grandmaster minor trait. I would just move this. I would move the minus 300 toughness while in Berserk mode to Primal Rage, the very first trait, to just clarify, similar to what Ranger does, to clarify its trade-off. But other than that, I think Berserker is pretty well balanced. I mean, I don't think it needs to be touched too much. I'm also not a huge Berserker player, so if any of you guys have ideas about increasing a slight cooldown, you know, increasing maybe a little bit of cast time, reducing some damage by like a little bit, you know, I'd love to hear in the comments. And so next, Spellbreaker. Spellbreaker's Conviction, specializing in boons, has left Spellbreakers vulnerable to conditions. Conditions deal increased damage to Spellbreakers. Now this, you might be like, oh my god, that sounds awful. However, there are some pretty powerful traits in Spellbreaker that remove conditions. And also, the healing skill, Natural Healing, if you look right below it, little preview, I don't think many people take it because of the long cast time, and you know, I'm just gonna get it over with right now. Natural Healing, I think the cast time should just be 1 second. 1.25 seconds, I mean, it's not that much longer, but I just don't think it's necessary when you have other heals that are like instant and do as much healing and simply remove conditions and only remove conditions. The one thing about Natural Healing is that it also removes boons, which is weird. If anything, I would say like remove 2 boons or 3 boons instead of just all boons. It's a very sometimes rough healing skill, but it does a lot of healing. So I think reducing the cast time is good enough. But additionally, removing those conditions would even be more important because you are taking slightly increased condition damage. And warriors were always meant, I don't want to say always meant, but when warriors were first being talked about, the developers, I would hear them saying that warriors are really great at power damage, they're tough, they have a lot of vitality, they can survive strikes, but they are weaker to conditions. That was old Guild Wars 2 balance philosophy. That is no longer the case, really. I don't think warriors need to be afraid of conditions because you have so many condition cleanses. But adding it back to Spellbreaker, I think it could be interesting, and thematically, you know, you're focused in on destroying the enemy's positive effects that you forget about the corrupting, damaging effects of yourself a little bit. So that's Warrior. Next, Ranger. Maul, Greatsword. Up the cast time to 1 second. It's very strong. Rapid Fire, I would up the cast time by a little bit. I think it's currently 2.5 seconds. I would just do 2 3/4 seconds. Or you might say even bump it up to 3 seconds, but it's very fast. And when you have a lot of quickness application on Ranger, this is even more damaging. This is even more powerful. So adding a little bit of an extra cast time, I think could maybe balance things out slightly. Sikkim, I would increase the cooldown to 38 seconds. Entangle, I would reduce the radius down to 300 because it is a survival skill. I don't think that this is great being such a large radius because you're no longer using it as a survival tool. You're using it as a damaging tool. And with Entangle, if people are up close to you, it entangles everyone that's around you, which hopefully would allow you to leave. They're entangled for many durations, many packets of Immobilize, they're getting bleeds, and this would allow you to still control a point pretty much, but not necessarily be able to control people outside of a capture point. Similarly with Immobilizes and the utter strength of Immob on Ranger, Jacaranda. Jacaranda is one of the most meta pets, as well as the Smoke Scale, and sometimes the Iboga. Jacaranda's Embrace currently will apply 5 seconds of Immobilize and keep you rooted. You have to retarget and kill and defeat an aspect of entangling roots, which is the Entangle Elite skill. This, I think, is too strong on a pet. Instead, I would just give it 1 stack of Immobilize for 2 seconds and increase the cooldown to 25 seconds because Immobs are very strong. Having a more consistent 2 seconds, you don't necessarily have to worry about someone killing it too early and not getting any use out of the skill. I think just a flat 2 seconds would streamline it a bit and also reduce its maximum power. Now for Druid. Astral Wisp. I think this should do more healing because you have to be in melee range, and it heals melee combatants. Reduce the damage by 10%, but increase the healing by 20%. Give a little bit extra love to staff, maybe. A little bit more, maybe some healing in Celestial Avatar. Or like when you're in Celestial Avatar, you heal allies more while not necessarily healing yourself as much. Interesting idea. Reduce the amount of energy that you need. Fine Surge. Cooldown up to 25 seconds because it is a very strong emote. And you know I want to be careful about emotes. Soul Beast. Also, additionally, Soul Beast and Druid, I think, already have their trade-offs. And their trade-offs inspired me to add them to all other elite specs. But Soul Beast. Sick'em damage bonus reduced to 20% while merged. I think by having it flatline would help a bit because Sick'em currently increases damage by 40%. It's currently at 25%, which is weird. I think by just flat halving it is perfectly fine because the player, of course, has more agency than a pet. Worldly Impact increased the cooldown to 30 seconds, and Smoke Assault increased the cooldown to 25 seconds. Once again, I'm a little wary about directly giving damage numbers and reducing damage numbers because people have different ideas about what damage should be at. But I think increasing some cooldowns by adding 5 seconds to the cooldown, it would, you know, allow for longer windows of like, I'm not going to get bursted, and inherently reduce the overall damage you can do in a match. But of course, this would also mean that Alacrity would be much more valuable in PvP, and maybe we would see Alacrity builds in PvP with increased cooldowns. Not like Astronaut. I'm not putting these cooldowns by like upping the cooldown by 40 seconds or anything, but a little bit here and there would be nice. Engineer. Full disclosure, I don't play Engineer, so I have even less stakes in this and even less ideas around it. So I am fully allowing myself to be wrong with these suggestions, and I fully welcome that. So for Engineer, Flamethrower, Flamejet, I've been seeing a lot of Flamethrower. I don't think this needs to deal extra damage to burning foes because it's the auto attack, and it has pretty decent range. So it can be really hard to dodge, get out of, and just, you know, so much burning on the Flamethrower already. It can be rough. Air Blast, reduce the knockback distance to 200, maybe. Iron Blooded, instead of 2% per condition, I think 1% is perfectly fine enough. So it reduces strike and condition damage by 1% per boon. And how many boons are there in this game? I feel like as a engineer, you can comfortably get like around probably 6 boons at any given time on yourself, even more. Sometimes I see engineers with like a full bar of boons, and I'm like, that's like 30% reduced damage if there are Explosive Temper, I would say reduce the ferocity gain to 10 instead of 20. Scrapper, Function Gyro, specializing in defenses. Scrapper's precision is lower. This would reduce your crit potential and crit frequency as a Scrapper because Scrappers are so bulky with their barrier and their boon application and stability and projectile destruction that I think that's perfectly fine in PvP, but I don't think Scrappers should be critting as much then. I don't want to necessarily reduce their power because that doesn't feel great. You could reduce your power by 150, but because power is such a consistent thing throughout everybody's kit, a little like iffy. Impact Savant. This is, I think, a minor. Conversion percent down to 5%. I think this was at 7% right now. It's a passive, you don't need to take it, and you can still get a lot of damage on Scrapper, that I think 5%, just bringing it down a little bit more, maybe that would be better. Reconstruction Field, I would reduce the radius to 240. Next, Hollowsmith Photon Projector. Specializing in strike damage, Hollowsmith's boon duration is reduced. So I want to have a bit of a duality. With Scrapper being so powerful with boons, Scrapper is still really good at damage, but Hollowsmith should really be the hard-hitting damage. And with that, I think reducing some of your own personal boon defenses is perfectly fine. So similar to another trade-off in this recommendation list, I think it'd be fine if Hollowsmith's self-boon duration is reduced by 10%. So you'll have to start relying more so on allies to get longer boon duration, and additionally, applying those boons to yourselves are even more precious because you're not necessarily getting them as much, so you really have to be like, okay, I'm gonna pop this stability. Might not have as long as I would on another spec, but now I have to really time it well, and when I get it off really well and it successfully lasts the duration I want, it's like, yes, I did it. And then finally, Prime Light Beam, I just increased the cooldown to 50%, or 50 seconds. It's a strong ability, it's a strong knockback, it does burning. Is it a combo field? It might be a combo field, I'm not exactly sure. But just a little bit of a cooldown increase. And the next, Thief. Shadow Refuge. I would decrease the cooldown by to 50 seconds. I don't think this would be that bad. Having a little bit of a AoE heal and stealth application in one location. Of course, there are many reveals in this game now. You can literally reveal yourself by dodge rolling out of something and like not noticing it. And it can be somewhat difficult, so I think we're decreasing the cooldown to 50 seconds is perfectly fine. Dagger Storm, I would reduce the range to 600. Currently it's 900, and I know it's mid-range, but I think 600 still allows you to do point damage and beyond, but 900 I feel like is extremely far, to the point where thieves can start casting Dagger Storm even from way behind and still start throwing daggers and bouncing them off and getting a lot of bleed and just nice damage off of it. So a slight range reduction I think would be perfectly okay. Next, Daredevil, Physical Supremacy. They already have changed Steel to Swipe, which forces you into more melee combat because it reduces the range down to 600. So it already has a trade-off. Impairing Daggers, I would say the mob should only be 1 second. I think that's okay. 1 second of a mob is still pretty strong in PvP situations, and 2 seconds of a mob, Impairing Daggers doesn't have that long of a cooldown. It's got great poison application, and it applies slow and already hits pretty hard. So I don't think the mob needs to be as long. Next, we have Deadeye. This trade-off I think is maybe the most imaginative I went, and perhaps people might not like it, but Deadeye's Gaze. Specializing in range damage, Deadeyes receive more damage from melee strikes. This means if someone is attacking you within your range of 150, you're taking 5% increased damage. Now, I didn't want to do 10% because I still think 10% could be a little too much, but I think 5% is impactful enough, but still yet small enough to not be like, oh my god, I'm not going to take Deadeye. But it also highlights the importance of playing at range. It would incentivize you to play a bit more with pistols, pistol builds, rifle builds as well, even though people still play with those. This would just be like, okay, now I really have to make sure that I'm setting up a good position and I'm not getting in melee. Even go for perhaps a down. Like, I think Deadeyes are great in securing a kill, but your teammate has to now go get the down. Unless you're doing a 1v1, you snipe someone from across the map, you stealth yourself, you shadow step over, and then you down them. That's perfectly fine. But this would really not be totally awful, but I think it might be a trade-off that is interesting to maybe think about. I don't know. And then be quick or be killed. I would just say power and precision was lowered to 150, just because I think when you get past 150 numerical stat increases in PvP, it can get a little scary. Oh my gosh, everyone, that was a whole hour of me talking about balance changes I would like to see before End of Dragons. I really didn't want to hit a lot of power coefficients or healing power coefficients all too hard, because I know people can get sometimes communities can get very defensive about that, but I feel like cast times and cooldowns, people might not necessarily be as reactive to that, and so they might need to think about it, be like, oh, I guess a little quarter of a second cast time wouldn't be that bad. Like, oh, increasing the cooldown by 5-10 seconds might not be that bad. So I think that's really where I would like to see Guild Wars choose PvP, because I think right now the power damage I think is good. I still think there are some glaring issues with some Ranger builds, some Reaper builds, even some Guardian builds, but I think increasing cooldowns would allow you to not necessarily see those bursts as frequently, but when they do come, they're still as impactful. And yeah, I think the damage numbers right now, I think it's pretty healthy, but just kind of slowing things down a little bit might make it easier to react to certain things, maybe give people increased reaction times, new players to be able to feel more comfortable coming into still a very fast-paced game mode, but not to the point where they're dying in a second. And even maybe increase the readability and the viewability of tournaments, and being like, hey, 5 skills aren't all blasting at each other at the same time, because all the skills have no cast times. They're instant cast. They have a cooldown of 5 seconds. It might make it a little bit more methodical. Just putting that out there. But this was a very fun video. I don't know if any of you are as interested in balance as I am, but I do think there should be more trade-offs. I think that's probably something I'm very, if anything, that's probably the one thing that I would like to see the most are these trade-offs by reducing toughness, reducing condition duration, you know, being more vulnerable to conditions, you know, really making a name for these elite specializations. Because I think right now, many elite specs have absolutely no trade-offs. So I would love to see more of that. But if you made it through this entire video, you need, thank you so much. Like the video if you liked it, comment below your thoughts about certain balance changes that I talked about here, or maybe some balance changes you would like to see. And yeah, subscribe if you'd like. I do a lot of Guild Wars 2 videos. I have links down below. I'm an official Revenant partner, and I will catch you all in the next video. Bye, everybody.